Hello. Do I advance these or are they already? Okay. Aha. Okay. Hi, everyone. So this is actually one of my favorite events. So I'm very happy to be here. Maybe someday I'll just be able to attend as a participant or as a attendee instead of actually having to present or whatever to show up here. But I apologize that I've been kind of distracted or whatever for this event. So I missed like Gert Jan's talk or whatever. So you can like yell at me later and so forth. But anyway, great to be here. Happy to discuss this subject. This actually is a topic that emerged through discussions with our keynote from last year, Chris Sanders, who was kind of holding me accountable for how I was using language in terms of defining indicators of compromise, indicators and artifacts and similar. And I thought that this was a really good topic to explore. So while Jamie previously went into the behavioral sort of aspect of how this works in terms of cyber threat intelligence, I missed a really good opportunity to use an Inception meme of we have to go deeper. Let's try to take a look at more foundational aspects of what it is that we use, what it is we talk about when it comes to specific technical observables within the threat intelligence space. So as Katie already introduced me, hi, I'm Joe Slowick. I am now on I think every year I presented here, I've had a different job. I really hope that trend stops. So yes. So currently at Miter Attack, filling the immense shoes that Katie has left behind. And yeah, let's get into it. So our agenda, we'll talk about an overview of indicators, what that means, which you might think is kind of silly. It's like, I know what a freaking indicator means or whatever. Why do I have to talk about this? And my question to you is, do you really? And we'll take a digression on language, then talk about reimagining indicators and observables to get towards clarity of meaning and a CTI ontology. So I'm using fancy words here or whatever. And honestly, like if you don't know what ontology means, that's cool. It's just a structured way of defining the different terms, items, constructs, or whatever that fit into a different sort of concept. Oh, I'm getting some hand wavy here, like maybe not so much or whatever. Yeah, there's a dictionary definition, but we can get into that later. Main thing is that let's start with an overview of indicators and what that means. So indicators, they're everywhere, right? You get a report, you see someone blog about something or whatever, or publish something, and it's like, where are the indicators? The number of tweets that I saw, or X's or whatever the hell they're called these days, related to the Midnight Blizzard activity that recently targeted Microsoft. Like, what are the indicators? It's like, it's account compromise and brute forcing. Like, what indicators do you want? But still, people are like, where are the freaking indicators? We need this in order to actually understand what's going on. Indicators are the common currency of threat intelligence reporting. If you don't have indicators, people get upset with you, quite frankly. But the thing is that we have to ask ourselves, like, what is an indicator? Like the name indicator indicates something, right? Well, it's a data point. It's an observable. It's something that signifies a given event, but it's also an object that allows us to communicate certain technical artifacts to another audience. That this hash value corresponds to this threat actor doing something at this point in time or in this environment. And all these sorts of things come together to define an indicator. Okay, that seems cool. But the thing is that we have lots of different terms that all kind of overload into each other when it comes to indicators that we use interchangeably without really asking ourselves, should we or why do we do this? So we have indicator, IOC, IOA, if you want to be fancy, I guess, although that term never caught on, observable, artifact, evidence, etc. All these items are used synonymously in communication to refer to something, and yet each of these terms, when we start unpacking them, has something a little bit different in terms of what they mean, what they indicate, what they refer to, and that can be a little problematic because as we start overloading these terms and combining them and using them interchangeably, we have to ask ourselves, are we communicating in a way that is consistent and sort of complete in a way that is reusable, not terribly confusing, and allows us to take some sort of action? So, the hell? Oh, indicator is an overloaded concept. We have lots of different ways of leveraging, using, and saying the term indicator, which means many terms are used interchangeably. The result is that we have a certain level of confusion in terms of purpose and meaning as far as what an indicator is, what it should be used for. Is it an item to take a defensive action? Is it an item to communicate one of these higher level behaviors or a signifier of those higher level behaviors? Or is it a forensic artifact along those lines? So in a perfect world, we would have indicators that have a certain level of contextuality surrounding them, that we understand the purpose, function, and significance of an indicator, why it matters, and when it was observed. All these sorts of metadata items that are often missing from that list of hash values or IP addresses that you see in the appendix following a blog article or similar. There should be a degree of accuracy. An indicator, to be useful, theoretically, should be tightly correlated to adversary activity. This obviously presents very significant issues when it comes to things like lol bins, lol bass, and similar, where we see adversaries leveraging legitimate items for malicious purposes. But the idea is that we should have some way of correlating a given technical observable fairly tightly with malicious activity to make it meaningful to defenders as well as to other audiences. And there should be some level of applicability. You have an indicator. Cool story, bro. What do I do with this? Well, that could be as simple as communicating a IP or a DNS sinkhole or something like that, or to start building a behavioral profile of an adversary, such as building a attack mapping or doing the sort of behavioral clustering we talked about with the ransomware as a service ecosystem yesterday. So the idea is that in a perfect world, we would get something like this. If you've seen me speak or whatever before, and I apologize, I'm being very pedantic when it comes to the topic of indicators because I'm weird. You might have seen this before, but this is a 10-year-old, more than 10 year, God damn it. Yeah, it's old at this point. Representation of what an indicator of compromise should be. If you go back to the original Open IOC blog series that Mandiant, then FireEye, then Mandiant, now Mandoogle or whatever, put out quite a while ago. And this idea, while very potent, never really caught on because that's honestly pretty complex to put together. Because the thing is that if we start talking about the birth of an indicator, this image is taken directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff Joint Publication 2-0 on intelligence, which has been revised, but the revised version is not publicly available. So yeah, exactly. It's like, what the hell, guys? Like, you did this like 2 years ago, and like, where is it? Anyway, the revised version of this diagram actually looks shittier, so I didn't even bother lifting it to use it. This is better. But the idea being is that the birth of an indicator starts with collecting various observations, various data points, and refining them in a certain way, like we saw in this item from the Mandiant Open IOC series of trying to put together specific observations in a way that we collect a variety of items together and show their relationship and how this denotes malicious activity. Well, the thing is that this continuous refinement is necessary to go beyond mere data. Here's an IP address to something happened. Hey, this IP address was contacted by our network to something of interest is identified. Oh, and by the way, this IP address is correlated with exfiltration of sensitive data from our environment following some other event of interest. That's really what we should be going towards. But the thing is that in reality, indicators don't quite rise to this standard. Oftentimes we have the lack of context, the lack of the sort of metadata that allows us to really orient what these items mean. Which means minimal enrichment in metadata surrounding a given item as it's shared, and thus an indicator as an enriched and a refined concept gets conflated with raw data, a hash value, a IP, a domain name, which in isolation can still be somewhat useful, but really doesn't allow us to make very many decisions without doing further research. Go pull the hash value from VirusTotal if it's available. Go look up the domain in domain tools, look at the IP address in census or so forth, just to name a few potential investigative outcomes. But also there's a limitation in terms of scope. Indicators are provided as is. Like, here's your hash value, like, that's cool. It's a SHA-1. I do MD5 because my tooling or whatever is 10 years old and hasn't been refined or whatever, when we all should be using SHA-256s. What do I do with that? Fun interview question if you want to really do a sort of mean thing to people or whatever is like, how do I convert a SHA-1 to SHA-256? Look it up in VirusTotal and then pull the other hash value. Yeah, anyway, The thing is that it's difficult to start extrapolating or building a sense of what's going on, provided a single data point. That how do I start telling the broader story, the purpose, function, and creation artifacts around that given item? A hash value really doesn't tell me much. Hashes are really great as a fairly rigid designator of a particular piece of software, malware or otherwise. But going from hash to what that thing does is damn near impossible. Well, it is impossible without grabbing the actual file and figuring out what the hell is going on. As a result, we're really sharing as indicators items that are just references to other things. They don't tell us a whole lot about what they're used for, how they matter, or what it is that we should do with reference to them. And thus indicators in reality, we get, the usual suspects. File names, file hashes, registry key values, if you want to get a little fancier and so forth, and network items like IP addresses, certificate hashes, and so forth. And what does this look like? Something along these lines. I don't have a laser pointer this year, so I can't blind anyone, unfortunately. But the idea is that and this is not picking on the vendor because everyone does this. I've done this. I'm pretty sure if you've written a public Pride Intel blog, you've done this too. Is like at the end, like here's all the indicators and so forth of what's going on. What does that mean? Like, hell if I know, without doing further work. And yet we call this communication, sharing in a certain sense, when we're really exhibiting very raw, very limited sorts of data. Because the thing is that we start talking about indicators as they are used as raw data, is that we're really talking about very specific identifiers of activity. They are particular examples of a more general behavior. So again, going back to the MITRE ATT&CK example that we have, pick a technique. I'm not as cool as Jamie and I've not memorized items. I always look things up or whatever, because why the hell shouldn't I? Of like, okay, here's a given behavior and here is a specific example of that behavior as reflected in an indicator. The thing is that in focusing on the indicator itself is that we lose the contextuality around what gave them birth, what created them, and how these items relate to one another and relate back to the adversary in question, what they were trying to do, their objectives, and how that worked out in practice. All right, digression on language. I'm weird. I don't have a computer science background. I started out in my career-ish or whatever before I started doing like contracting and whatnot as a philosophy student, which I dropped out from, which means you too could be a threat intelligence analyst someday, despite failure. But you might ask yourself, like, Joe, what the hell, man? Like, isn't this all just like nitpicking or whatever? And, nitpicking. Like, tell me something that's useful. This kind of sucks. Well, the thing is that we can take a digression on language. There's a variety of ways we can take this. I'm going to use a Lewis Carroll example here. Who's actually read Through the Looking Glass? Yay! Okay, not zero. That's awesome. But the Humpty Dumpty theory of language, that a word, to paraphrase, a word means whatever I assert it to be at that given point in time, which kind of goes back to what it is that we're talking about when it comes to how we use the term indicator, that we're not really sticking with a very rigid definition that is commonplace and consistent, but really blending a lot of items together, such as raw data, artifact, and indicator of compromise, and all using these items all fairly interchangeably. Because the thing is that in accurate language, maybe this just means that I need to take fiber pills or something like that or whatever and so forth, but it's pretty important in the sense that language defines how we communicate and understand concepts. Without having a clear view or a clear understanding of what it is that we're communicating, we inhibit or we limit follow-on action as well as comprehension of what it is that we're communicating. So looking back a few slides at the, I used a Trellix example, but you could have put a Mandiant example or a Dragos example or a whomever example in place of it, of providing this list of hashes and whatnot. Like, what is it that we're actually saying and what does that mean? And by critically examining how we describe matters can start improving our accuracy as well as the applicability and actionability of these items, or at least so I hope. You can tell me that I'm full of crap later. The thing is that the word indicator and its relatives may appear to be inconsequential save for their use. Like, I don't give a crap about all this, Joe. Like, I just need these indicators to throw into my EDR product or whatever and alert me if I see any of this in my environment. Well, the thing is that being loose with these details and explanations can be honestly a little dangerous, or at least suboptimal for making consistent and effective defensive decisions. So we've seen the death of the indicator ad nauseum. So going back 7-ish years or whatever to the Kaspersky Front news organization's thread post, which I don't think exists anymore. An opinion article about, the death of the indicator. Hey, I don't think I've actually seen this in a slide yet. So do I get a prize? Or I know we've mentioned it. Yeah, exactly. Woo, pyramid of pain. Dave's not here, is he? No, damn it. Okay. Anyway, we've talked about this with the pyramid of pain, and we've seen lots of think pieces about like death of the indicator, get towards behaviors and whatnot. Well, the thing is that we still use indicators and they still have an awful lot of value. Maybe we should try to figure out what it is indicators actually mean, what it is they can actually do, and resurrect them in a fashion that allows us to take advantage of what is honestly a fairly useful, fairly significant sort of concept that can be applied for defensive purposes. So while indicator has become a bad word in InfoSec, how many talks about like indicators suck, you need to go to behaviors, go map things to attack or whatever, the indicators are not helping you, you need indicators to build detections and so forth. Yeah, I mean, that's true to a point, but for a lot of organizations, and especially from a common communication perspective, indicators form that baseline, that foundation upon which this higher level analysis is built. And by ignoring that foundation, we build a sort of rickety structure on top of this that is not as firm or as solid as it could be. And so maybe we've played fast and loose with the idea of the indicator and therefore need to revisit it in a fashion and become a bit more rigorous in how we're leveraging and defining that concept. Let's reimagine indicators as well as observations and other items that lead up to the birth of a formal indicator of compromise. So what is an indicator? We talked about this already, right? Katie mentioned that like if I pull 7 random people from the audience, I'll probably get about 4-ish reasonably different answers about what this means. Well, that's because indicators can mean a number of different things. It is a technical observable, and as such is a communication object. This adversary leveraged this infrastructure to do something. Here is that infrastructure so that you could look for it or you can refer to it as well. It's also an artifact of compromise. From a forensic perspective, going back to the original birth of the indicator of compromise as a concept by the Mandiant folks, is that indicators of compromise were used as a forensic shortcut to identify, like, has this host been compromised by something that we've already identified, and therefore can associate these specific technical observables with a known adversary. But it's also a behavioral artifact, getting us into things like attack mapping and behavioral clustering and so forth, and thus becomes an intelligence observable, that this cluster of indicators, this cluster of technical observables relates to a specific sort of behavior or a consistent set of actions that a given adversary takes, and thus allows us to start formulating an idea of what that more general sort of activity looks like. These hashes are all applied for this reason, allowing us to build that sense of why an adversary is taking certain sorts of actions. But that's problematic, isn't it? Because indicators have many applications, and multiple applications result in multiple views. If I say indicator, I could be meaning any of these sorts of things, which I would argue is a little problematic because depending upon your perspective, your audience, and your application can be a little overlapping and confusing. Thus, an application-centric understanding of indicators, I would argue, is not just preferable, but honestly necessary to try to get that clarity of language to avoid miscommunication, confusion, and so forth. So indicators as technical observations of an action or event is, I would argue, self-evident. Like I have a hash value, like this indicator that this adversary used this software at this point in time. Cool story. But we can spread this out in terms of pre and post actions. So prior to the application of that hash value, there is source code that existed somewhere on some bad actor's machine that was written, compiled, and then designed to do certain sorts of actions. And it's those actions and that intentionality that gets us into that specific application of how that item was used, which gets us into the post indicator actions of when was this observed and how was it observed, to get into the applications of that indicator and how it was leveraged in operations, the why this indicator even popped up in the first place. And by digging into these items, we can start getting into a greater and deeper understanding of what's going on. That yes, I have a specific item at a specific point in time that manifested itself, but that item only manifested itself because the adversary started out with some intention to deliver ransomware, to exfiltrate sensitive data or to gain just initial access into an environment. And that action itself led to specific artifacts of its use that we can then leverage as a forensic item as well as a CTI communication object to try to identify adversary activity later on. So now if we revisit our, I'm sorry, picture, these slides are going to be available, man, but okay. So revisiting our munged sort of conception of the birth of an indicator, we can look at this as a process. I mean, it's already represented here in this diagram from the Joint Chiefs of Staff of going from the universe of all possible observations and refining that through a collection plan to specific data points of interest, which then through processing and exploitation give us the observations that are potentially linked to adversarial behavior, and then through final analysis and production give us an indicator that has an intelligence value to it. The idea being is that we yeet various data points into the ether or whatever repeatedly and call that intelligence, when really when it comes to the application and the understanding of what these technical observations mean, we need to do a little bit more work, which sucks because no one likes to do work. I'm lazy, you're late, maybe you're lazy, I don't know. Humans are lazy, but by doing this additional bit of homework of not just dropping a CSV of lots of values, but trying to enrich and refine these items to add that additional contextuality as well as signifiers of use, how these items originated and so forth, we can arrive at something that becomes not just a specific observation at a specific point in time that something bad happened, but rather start relating these things and migrating up the pyramid of pain or identifying the given behaviors as linked in the attack matrix and so forth that these items are actually related to. So indicators, God, yeah, just indicators, right? I'm gonna see me in a room or whatever, just like fetal position, rocking back and forth or whatever, saying indicators at some point. But the idea is that indicators are a sign that something has happened and that these post observations of when they are applied tell us that something has occurred and can give us an indication of how we should look for these things, how we start building defense. But from a threat intelligence perspective, it's those pre-observations of why did this indicator generate in the first place? What was the adversary trying to achieve? What was the goal? What was the purpose? Start getting us into those more enlightened questions and the higher level understanding. Thus, we start getting into a concept that is very near and dear to my heart of sort of breaking apart indicators beyond just the specific technical observation itself to revealing the elements that combine to put them together into a specific observation in the first place. And thus, indicators as composite objects. I don't think I presented this at SANS CTI. I did present it at RSA, which is where that first image comes from. This is something that I wrote up when I was at Domain Tools a few years ago. Again, every year, different job. But the idea being that as we start looking at technical indicators, we often have this conception that a hash value is an indicator and therefore it is self-evident and complete on its own, when really the hash value is just a given item of metadata for some file that existed at some point in time that was used for malicious purposes. And by understanding that relationship, we can start breaking apart the file item and understanding that there are a variety of items that relate to it that tie into its construction, its use, as well as its application to achieve adversary goals. Similarly, on a network infrastructure perspective, yes, I have a bad domain. Like, okay, I have Microsoft.xyz. That's patently bad. It's probably owned by Sinkhole by someone at this point anyway. But just bear with me for a minute here. That domain certainly may be malicious, but it is a signifier of an adversary registering infrastructure with a certain naming schema that is meant to blend in with something, as well as the fact that that domain had to be registered through some registrar. The adversary had to choose a naming schema and a TLD, and then it had to be hosted somewhere, whether that's trying to be geographically close to victims or just using some random bulletproof hosting provider or whatever that won't ask any questions, that all of these reflect on adversary choices, adversary decisions that start indicating the adversary's desires, their goals, their objectives in creating these items. And by getting to this level of understanding that an indicator as a concept starts to become a item reflecting on adversary objectives and purposes, we can start looking at indicators not as just a very bare sort of forensic artifact, but rather as a signifier of adversary intent and purpose, thus an intelligence object. Thus, adversary actions in tradecraft start from somewhere. I am Mr. Bad Hacker or whatever, real elite hacksaw or whatever, something or other, and I want to do bad stuff. Cool story. Well, my intentions to mine Bitcoin on your unpatched web server or something like that require that I action them in some way, which means I have to figure out how do I deliver an exploit or deliver some payload, or what software do I install in order to make that happen, or to blend in my XMRig miner or whatever with legitimate software. Well, those actions, those purposes start yielding indicators of use. But as we start aggregating these items and looking beyond just the specific example of like, oh, I had an XMRig miner dropped on my unpatched WordPress instance or something or other, but start looking at broader perspectives of either the threat actor in general, or if I can get that level of visibility into campaign objects, a very sticky subject that I'm working on in my current role, that we can start figuring out how these items not just relate to one another, but what are the points of connection or points of commonality that allow me to start going from a specific observation to how these observations are linked. And it's those links that, the connections between these that start allowing us to start to make assessments of what are the behaviors underlying the specific technical observations. And we can do this ad nauseum if we can just continue to gather information. And I apologize to our graphic artist here or whatever, I'm going pretty fast. And if we do this in an iterative fashion, we can start not just building a profile of an adversary, mapping them to attack, doing a diamond model analysis, or I guess using the kill chain if you're old like me, and refine that perspective over time through continuous data collection and analysis. Okay, Joe, what the hell are you talking about? So how do we start making this matter? How do we start making this relevant? Well, the thing is that data, observation, evidence, indicator, etc., all refer to slightly different things, overlapping to be sure, but by having clarity and meaning and understanding what each of these items denote and their significance, we can start understanding the relationships between them and how these items link together, and can start formulating a more refined understanding of adversary activity, as well as how we record it, communicate it, and leverage these items in order to understand it. So we start off with data. Got to start somewhere, right? And that's the universe of available observations. Requires filtering, collection plans, or you just do Splunk, whatever your data source is, equal star. Like you can't do anything with that. We need to filter this in some sort of fashion. Thus, collection, processing, et cetera, are required for this to be of use. But once we filter that down into something where we can start linking data points to adversary actions, we start giving evidence and artifacts, that refined set of data that links to a incident or a item of interest. Like, why did this unsigned binary downloaded from a previously unseen network location run in my environment? That's an artifact that something interesting happened. But it's not an indicator yet, because I need to tie that back to an adversary action based on analysis and understanding of what's going on in the environment to refine that artifact that something interesting may have occurred to like, oh, this is related to TA69, Cozy Bear, Fozzie Bear, whatever, and so forth. But really making this sort of dive down into how does this all tie together. And thus, the benefits of this is that we start getting clarity and meaning around what these objects are. Do I just have here's some data that looked interesting, but I have no idea what it means, thus yeet the indicators out into the void. Or I have refined items that are tightly correlated with a given intrusion and therefore rise to the level of being a true indicator of known compromise. I can start getting an idea of the relationship between the origin of a given item that, hey, I observed this, it was used for this purpose, and therefore start understanding what is the behavior represented by this given indicator when it's used in my own environment or some other victim's environment, and thus start scoping the context around this, that yes, this is the specific observation of how this adversary worked at this point in time, but that temporal observation links back into a more general behavior, which can be represented through multiple other indicators that if I can tie them together, I start getting a more enriched understanding of what that behavior is and what that behavior means, and can do things like detection, engineering, fronting, and similar along those lines. And through all of this, I can start improving my communication so that I'm letting various audiences know, my IR team, my CTI peers, my SOC analysts, or so forth, of when I communicate a data point, this is what it means. This is a unenriched data point that requires further analysis, or this is a tightly correlated indicator of compromise that represents adversary actions within a victim environment. So in mapping this sort of terminology to actions, this is a very busy slide or whatever. Adam's gonna like kill me for this one. The idea being is that data provides us a foundational element and gives us our initial sort of crack at things, but we can't really do anything with that on its own. It's a starting point. Moving on from raw data, we have the evidence and artifacts of like, okay, like I see that these items show in my logs or EDR telemetry or similar, and now starting to link them to like, oh, this is kind of weird or whatever, how this manifested or what this is related to. I can start refining those initial data points to objects of specific interest that still require further analysis to understand what's going on, which gets us to the final stage of an indicator that, oh, not only was this item an evidence that something took place, interesting, but it is correlated with or linked to a given threat actor behavior or threat actor action that makes us an indicator that a compromise has occurred or is occurring. So in applying this to future efforts, we want to determine the nature, origin, and limitation of these sorts of objects and apply them in ways that are relevant to the capabilities and limitations inherent to them. Understand that when you're just dealing with raw data, what does that mean and what does that allow you to do? What decisions does that enable? And then going sort of into the more refined aspect of like, if I've been able to build a indicator of compromise or indicator of attack, or however you want to define this, or what words you want to use to denote this concept of what that means in the sense of this is a data point that represents an adversary's behavior and intentions at a specific point in time and through a specific way of generating that or making it happen. And really the so what behind this, what's the purpose of intelligence, generally speaking? It's not to make ourselves look important, write blogs or whatever, and get up on stage and give talks. It's to improve decision making. That is the point of intelligence. Well, similarly, the point of this entire discussion is that by having greater clarity in meaning, language, and understanding of what these items mean, is that we can leverage these sorts of terms and these objects in such a fashion that we're improving not just our understanding of what it is that we're talking about, but leveraging that in such a fashion that we can improve decision making through clearer communication and understanding how these items tie back not just to a specific instance at a point in time, but the higher level so what behind this in terms of what adversaries were trying to do. So I thought I had less time than what I was given. Look at me. Yeah, it's okay. Like, you know, the vaudeville came for Jamie previously because he went a little bit over, but it's all good.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. We'll give you a first round of applause. And we do have a couple minutes for questions, which is great because there are a lot of them. So we'll get through as many as you have the energy and we have time for.
Okay.
I'll start with the Slack one, and then folks in person, if you have a question, raise your hand. We have someone running a mic. So I wasn't familiar with this one. The question's about if we're getting on track with how to communicate, how to use indicators. There's actually a new RFC 9424 that came out in August. So I didn't know that.
I recall this being released, and I have questions about it.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's one of those things that was written by someone who isn't a CTI person.
So
I need to get back to it.
I hadn't actually read it. So, but regardless of that, the question around, do you feel like with something like that, we're getting back on track on how to effectively communicate about using indicators? If not, what do you think is still missing?
I think it's a combination of things. One, it's sort of drawing a line in the sand of like, when I say indicator, this is what it means. I mean, this is, the point, the purpose behind things like wider attack is like, okay, let's try to figure out a common framework of referring to different items so that when I say something, it has a given, predictable, and consistent meaning across communication items. We haven't done that with indicators yet because we've seen the sort of, we had the open IOC series from over 10 years ago. If you go back further than that, you could look at things from like Richard Baitlick and others who have looked at the origin of indicators and so forth. And from this primordial soup of technical observations and IR data or whatever back before, maybe some people in the audience were in high school even, that we got this idea of what these things would mean, but no one ever really standardized on them or standardized on them effectively. And so we've seen, instead of consistency and sort of migration towards a common meaning, into instead like just means whatever the hell I want. And we'll just go from there. Here's my appendix at the end of the blog with like 50 hashes or whatever, indicators of compromise. Good story.
I like the term primordial CTI soup. I'm gonna have to use that one. We'll go to the room. Any questions in the room? Give you all a chance. Or I have a ton in Slack, so if not, we got one over there. Just we'll wait for the mic. You can use
That's
one.
good.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question about, so if we could look at an indicator of attack as a chain, both artifact, an indicator, a MITRE behavior, compile all these, does anyone know of a good tool that would kind of work with that to compress all that data into something that could be distributed, maybe via JSON, through an internal threat intelligence sharing platform?
I mean, we have
Look-
options. This is something when we start getting into like vendor space now or whatever. So if I say a name, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily endorsing it. If I make fun of a name, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a bad guy. But, we have, whether we're talking about things like MISP, for example, as being a framework, or Sticks.
Sticks
But
is JSON.
it is.
I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah, that we can start looking at ways of structuring data in a fashion that allows for linkages and ways of representing these items. More recently, we have like, damn it, what is it, the Vertex thing?
Synapse.
Synapse, thank you. It looks like it's a more robust way of trying to leverage this with data science and so forth. That there are options out there. I would say that the thing that I get, and especially when I do consulting and whatnot, people ask me about like, well, how do I build like a database of indicators and malicious objects? And it's like, well, understand that even if you're ingesting freely available data, it's free like puppies, not like beer, in that these require care and feeding, and you're only going to get the sort of effort that you put into it in towards designing, ingesting, and enriching these items, as opposed to anything else. So there is no magic wand, so to speak, of like, oh, here's a technical item, I drop it in something and magic happens and I get all my lovely enrichments. I mean, there's pipelines you can design with pulling from external data sources and so forth to add certain items, but you still have to write all that and pay for that as well, because none of those items are necessarily, well, very few of them are free. So there's a variety of issues or friction points around this that need to be addressed and understood, so that, yes, you can write this up in YAML, JSON, or take your pick or whatever, still work, and it's still coming up with a taxonomy. Like, again, and now with my MITRE hat on or whatever, attack is a taxonomy. Well, maybe we need to go a level deeper and start getting into an indicator taxonomy and standardizing around that. And so far, there's just multiple competing, all these standards suck or whatever. Like, we're going to have a new standard. Like, there are now 17 competing standards, the XKCD item. Trying to figure out a way to make this happen. This is a open question. I don't know how to do this. So if you have an idea, like, all ears. But I would argue that the state of the now is problematic for this reason.
Can we expect MITRE attack for indicators next? Is that what you're saying?
What's up, Adam?
Now I'm just scrolling my
I mean,
former
honestly,
teammate.
it's an area I think that we can look into.
It's a good political answer. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's space to do something along these lines, because again, the state of the now is suboptimal, to use a fancy word, and we could do better.
Absolutely. Question in the back, and then we'll go to one from Slack.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how in an indicator data model to best incorporate relevance with respect to time.
Yeah, that's a tough question, because, for example, a hash value absent a collision will be a specific designator of a given piece of malware until the end of time. An IP address, however, especially given adversary tendencies to do things like pop someone's Soho router and leverage that as a hop point, that is going to be a very ephemeral object, and therefore what was malicious last month is going to be completely benign the next. So I think there's a combination of understanding the nature and purpose of a given item, and then leveraging that understanding to try to set some expectation of timeliness and relevance behind the given object. Again, that isn't easy. Yeah, it's like when I like do teaching or whatever, it's like nothing I'm going to say is easy today. That's why we get paid the big bucks, I think. Some of us, maybe, I don't know.
Medium bucks, maybe.
Medium bucks, yeah. Nice bucks, yeah. Um, but yeah, like sussing that out or whatever is a very it depends sort of question.
I'm trying to do that at scale, adding timing.
Hard as hell.
That is tough. If
Yeah.
anyone figures that out, we'd love to see us talk on that next year.
Well, and this is something, I'm sorry if I'm like going off topic here, but like,
Right.
for example, Cyber War Dog and Froggers. or whatever.
Roberto.
Yes, Roberto. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I know him more by his Twitter handle than I know him by his name. Like their talk on the use of AI models or machine learning models in terms of threat intelligence. Like this is an area I would think not so much identifying the contextuality behind items, but figuring out ways of using link analysis to see, okay, based upon the object in question and the artifacts that relate to it, how can I leverage similar objects and their timing values or whatever to start coming up or computing an answer for what is the likely age or consistency around that. That seems like a useful application that can be fueled through human-enabled intelligence that then gets fed into a model to come up with a reasonable projection of what might be the sort of time to live for a given item.
I like that. And you could even bring in like infrastructure tracking, like
Yep.
external sources. Huh. Intriguing. If someone does AI stuff and wants to run with that, again, great talk for next year.
Yeah.
We'll go to a Slack question. So Barry asks about what are some practical steps we could use to try to retrain, realign what an indicator is within our organization? And he said, other than sharing your talk, of course, when it comes out.
Right. I think, it starts with us in terms of what we're doing, that, trying to go beyond just like, hey, SOC, here's a list of hashes that I pulled from this blog or whatever, or a bunch of domains or whatever that I was able to do some link analysis and come up with registration patterns. Go do something with this, to explaining why these items matter, what they mean, and so forth. Again, not easy. And it requires effort, but I think in starting to hold ourselves accountable to making distinctions between what is a raw data point that requires enrichment to be useful versus sharing a more enriched and complex object like a full-on indicator of compromise is the work that we kind of need to do, and start leveraging our understanding of how these items differ and communicate them as separate objects instead of bundling them all into being, these are all indicators and are treated one and the same.
Kind of a related question from Slack, talking about the difference between IOC, indicator of compromise, and IOA, indicator of attack. The question being, why would you say there's not a difference, or is there a difference between those? What are your thoughts there?
There is a difference, because you can look at an indicator of compromise. Indicator of compromise started out as a forensic concept. That is how Mandiant leveraged the term, is that it is an indicator of a known compromise based upon prior analysis and prior incidents. Indicator of attack is indicator of something is happening or whatever. It is not a completed compromise yet, but a sign of what adversaries are doing. However, if you look at what are represented by those items or whatever, it ends up kind of being the same thing. So definitely there is a distinction in meaning and purpose behind how these items originated, but in terms of actual application, they all sort of coalesce. It's the same idea, like crabs evolved like 57 different times or whatever across different arthropod genuses.
From primordial soup.
Exactly. So it's all crabs at the end of the day, which is kind of a weird statement if it's taken out of context. But the idea being is that these are sort of like
I got nothing on that. Yeah.
You got nothing on that.
Just leave
but
that alone.
the idea being, though, is that there's sort of a converged evolution of these items to all sort of go towards that path of least resistance to, it's like, okay, here's your hashes, or here's your IPs or whatever, even if we want to call them IOAs, IOCs, data, et cetera, is that there's a tendency for us all to coalesce around the same sort of stuff at the end of the day, because it's force of habit, or crabs.
One of the two. Other questions in the room? We'll give folks in the room a chance if you have anything else. We have a couple minutes before lunch. I actually wanted to dive into group naming, if you're willing, because there was a question, I think, to Jamie's talk, and this is a hot topic and we all hate it, but we keep talking about it. The question that came in via Slack earlier was actually about, right, is there something that maybe someone at MITRE, maybe on the MITRE attack team, could do, keeping a centralized group name repo to help us all try to sort out the bears and the APTs and all of that. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, arguably, as you know, it already exists to a degree that if you look at attack in terms of the different objects that make out the attack landscape, is that, okay, everyone's familiar with the techniques, but there's also categories of software and groups that exist in that framework as well. The issue at the moment is, sort of the same thing in terms of defining an indicator, for example, is drawing that line in the sand of like, okay, guess what, everyone? Knock your heads together. This is how we're doing things. And then people embracing it. We've seen that with attack as a way of defining behavioral items or behavioral representation in terms of attack IDs and so forth. But a lot of this is going to come from, MITRE or whomever can stand up and say like, this is the taxonomy of group names, or someone can make a Google spreadsheet or whatever and say like, this is how everything maps together, even if it's wrong. Sorry, Florian. But the idea being is that it needs buy-in from other people to work. So there has to be an agreement, not just from someone saying like, everyone get your shit together. This is what we're doing now. And then vendors have to say like, okay, like we'll do this now. So that's the challenge behind that. Working on it.
Nice.
Yeah.
If people would be like willing to buy in, like if I work for a vendor who names groups, like could they chat with you at the summit? Could they reach out?
Certainly.
I think it'd be an interesting discussion. I think we all have this challenge and, like there are overlaps, maybe not exact, but maybe we can do better.
It's one of those things where it's not like the law of gravity where it's like, hey, if you think this is wrong or whatever, you're gonna have a bad time. It's more like, what side of the road do we drive on? That is an item of convention. And it really doesn't matter which side we drive on, just that everyone drives on the same side. And it's getting that agreement or whatever of like, don't do things like wrong, like the English do or whatever, but do things in the right way. And
Apologies to anyone from the UK watching. We love you and your tea, especially our Earl Grey.
yes. Anyway, but the idea being is that it's an item of convention. As long as people agree to the convention, then good things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Takes community buy-in, which same thing for attack. And I mean, to agree on the definition of indicator, perhaps we might need community buy-in as well.
Yep.
Any last questions in the audience before we let Joe go? All right. Well, I imagine you'll hang out for a couple minutes.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate it.